Welcome to Talking Strategy and Season 3. My name is Paul O'Neill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Talking Strategy is a RUSI podcast series in which Professor Beatrice Husser and I talk to experts about strategy and the strategists that have shaped our ideas about the world. Standing on the shoulders of these strategy giants, the series provides an introduction to key thinkers from across the ages and around the world, in which we will be examining the influences on them and the impact they and their ideas have had on us and our potential adversaries. So allow me to hand over to my friend and colleague Beatrice. Beatrice, welcome. The chair is yours.
Thank you, Paul. He has been described as the most influential person you've never heard of, but Soviets and the Chinese certainly had. He was hailed by a former KGB officer as the Grey Cardinal, the Eminence Grise of the American Revolution in military affairs, as the great hero of Chinese officers tracking developments in American military technology, claiming that they had translated every word he ever wrote. Andrew Marshall. Andrew, or Andy Marshall's career spanned 7 decades, including 25 years at the RAND Corporation, where he worked alongside Herman Kahn, for example. As an organization composed of some of the most influential advisors to senior US administration officials, RAND developed and matured methods of analyzing the nature of the long-term competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the late 1960s, Henry Kissinger, also a former RAND member, recruited Andrew Marshall to apply these approaches in the National Security Council, where Marshall worked for several years before becoming the first director of Net Assessment, a post he held for the next 43 years. Dr. Thomas G. Mankin is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He's a senior research professor at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at the Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. After a distinguished previous career in and out of government, he currently serves as a member of the congressionally mandated 2022 National Defense Strategy Commission and as a member of the Army Science Board. He is the co-editor of the prestigious Journal for Strategic Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today from Washington.
It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
Andy Marshall is credited with having invented net assessment, something that is all the rave now in NATO countries. Net assessment is an analytical approach to assessing an adversary's as well as one's own capabilities in relation to one another. How does this work?
That's a wonderful question. If we go back to Sun Tzu, we can read the famous aphorism, know the enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles, you'll be undefeated. And that's wonderful advice, but Master Sun doesn't exactly tell us how to do it. It's sort of the strategic version of buy low, sell high. And net assessment is all about that. It is all about measuring military balances. But in order to measure military balance, you need to understand an adversary, a competitor, and you need to understand their strengths and weaknesses. And that's very challenging for all sorts of reasons. Secrecy, deception. But then, of course, you also have to understand yourself. And self-knowledge can be very difficult as well for a whole bunch of different reasons. Bureaucracy, maybe self-deception. And so net assessment is really all about that. It really is all about coming up with a side-by-side diagnostic assessment of a military balance, but also a head-to-head one, trying to think about how the competitors would actually stack up, not just on some metaphorical balances, but how they might actually interact and clash on the battlefield.
I see 2 themes that seem to be the roots of this approach that Andy Marshall had, 2 themes that stretch through his career all the way from when he started with RAND in 1950. Namely, on the one hand, a sort of statistical approach, a very mathematical approach, which he had from the World War II Strategic Bombing Survey, where he worked alongside people like Robert McNamara, one supposes. And the other one is to look at how intelligence brings this material together and analyzes it. Those are the 2 roots, I think, of what he was doing. But then he added a lot more to that. He became very multidisciplinary. At the end of his life, he professed great interest in reading history. And much of the work that he commissioned, which was very, very diverse, included historical studies. So what was his methodology?
If you were here with us, you might even bridle at the use of the M word. He had a very multidisciplinary approach long before multidisciplinary approaches were in vogue. In part, he got that from his time at RAND, and he certainly nurtured that during his time in Washington, D.C. You're right that he had a mathematical background. His academic background was in mathematics, and he was drawn to economists, but he was also drawn to political scientists, to historians. If I were to add a major thread in his work, it actually comes from the business literature, but the part of the business literature that really has to do with organizational behavior and psychology. And I really think that was a key influence. For him, when we talk about, say, interaction, it wasn't a mathematical formula. It wasn't the collision of a couple of billiard balls. Interaction was about complex organizations making imperfect decisions based upon limited understanding of themselves and the other. So I think his approach, whether to long-term competition with the Soviets or thinking through things in the 21st century, really stands in opposition to a lot of the action-reaction arms race literature or this idea of states as unitary actors. I think he was fundamentally at ease with uncertainty in a way that a lot of other thinkers have not been.
Despite the fact that he came from this mathematical statistics background and he'd done some engineering in the Second World War, apparently, he was much more open to seeing the world in ways which could not be reduced to a single formula of one independent variable, one dependent variable, but try to see it as a much more complex system. What's the result of this? What are the sort of publications that came out of his Office of Net Assessment? What did he write himself? Can you give us a broad overview?
For most strategic thinkers, we immediately go to their writings and we judge them based on their writings. There actually is a very impressive body of work that he did at RAND, where his primary job was doing research and analysis and writing reports. Again, it's very impressive, particularly for the time. His work on long-term competition with the Soviets, which was really finished in the late 60s. It wasn't really published even in a redacted version until the 1970s. Really reflects this view of long-term competition between actors working on imperfect information, trying to influence each other. His work also published at RAND on measuring military power. It's a short piece that even speaks to us today, where he points out that this notion of military power is so central to international relations, to strategic studies. However, the closer you look at it, the more problematic the concept becomes. And he points out in that piece that we haven't really come to grips with the problem of measuring military power. And I think that's as true today as it was in the late 60s when he wrote it. Then, of course, when you move to the White House, where he was briefly, and then the Pentagon, where he was, as you say, for 4 decades, his influence is a little bit more difficult to track. He's not writing monographs for public consumption or even for consumption of, say, the leadership of the Air Force. He's writing for the leaders of the Defense Department. And so there, tracking his influence, one has to think about how his colleagues, his office influenced the thinking of senior leaders in the Pentagon, which the office did in a number of ways, both through its work, its assessments, through the ideas that the office developed, things like competitive strategies, things like this idea of a revolution in military affairs, which, of course, didn't strictly arise within the Office of Net Assessment. It actually arose from a series of sources. But Marshall highlighted that as something that senior defense leaders should be thinking about. And then he also had influence through the broader array of scholars that affiliated themselves with the Office of Net Assessment. So tracking his influence as a maker of modern strategy, to steal a title from Edward Mead Earle and Peter Paret, during his RAND years, it's fairly straightforward. But then as a policymaker, as a public servant, it becomes a little bit more challenging.
You've spoken about what we now call complex adaptive systems and this idea of emergent strategy. And I can see, therefore, why his interest in organisation design, because, of course, it's the organisations that have to adapt to respond. What impact do you think he had on the culture of the US military or the US government in terms of coping with that emergence, that willingness to accept the uncertainty you've highlighted?
That's a wonderful question. I don't know that he would judge his impact as being all that great. It's back to the nature of organizations. They're very difficult to influence. I think he would have judged his success much more on the ability to inform and influence senior leaders and help them in their interactions with these large, complex national security organizations. He once told me, before any strategy can influence a competitor, it first has to survive your own system. And that's absolutely true. It's one of those brilliant but basic insights. I think understanding the complex nature of organizations is key to bureaucratic effectiveness, but it also sort of limits the art of the possible in many cases.
In an interview that was conducted with him, he was very, very modest. And he claimed, for example, that Henry Kissinger and he had not necessarily been colleagues or known each other very well at RAND. And yet it was Kissinger who called him first to the White House and then put him in the Department of Defense. Kissinger clearly appreciated his ideas and was probably one of those people one could list as being influenced by him. What other individuals did he really work with very closely? And what other individuals who had power in the American security community were influenced by him?
I would start with 3 secretaries of defense. And they happen to be the first 3 secretaries of defense who were in office on the establishment and after the establishment of the Office of Net Assessment. The first was Jim Schlesinger. Now, Schlesinger and Marshall were colleagues at the RAND Corporation. They were also close personal friends. And when Andy Marshall left the White House, it really was Jim Schlesinger who asked him to come to the Pentagon rather than returning to beautiful Santa Monica, California at the RAND Corporation, prevailed upon Marshall to come to the Pentagon and establish the Office of Net Assessment. And Schlesinger really, as Secretary of Defense, saw himself as sort of the strategist in chief for the Defense Department. And he saw a real role for the Office of Net Assessment in advising him and advising the leadership of the Pentagon on the future direction of the defense program. But then Schlesinger left and was replaced by a man who at the time was the youngest Secretary of Defense ever to serve, and that man was Donald Rumsfeld. And Rumsfeld was a very different type of leader. He'd been an elected member of Congress. He'd been the White House Chief of Staff, and he didn't really know a lot about defense. But he was used to seeking out and getting strategic advice. And so when Rumsfeld arrived at the Pentagon, again, sort of naively, he said, well, where's my strategic advice office? And somebody in Rumsfeld's office said, well, it's the Office of Net Assessment. And Rumsfeld walked out of his office, walked down the hall to the Office of Net Assessment and knocked on the door. And there was Andy Marshall opening the door. And that led to a very productive relationship there, where Marshall and his office were able to provide advice of a different sort that would be useful to Rumsfeld in the decisions he had to make. Third was Jimmy Carter's Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown. Now, you might think that an office established by Richard Nixon and established by Jim Schlesinger might have been in jeopardy first when Jim Schlesinger left and Donald Rumsfeld came in. But then clearly when the Nixon and Ford administration left and Carter was ushered in. But in fact, Harold Brown, as Secretary of Defense, was just that sort of defense intellectual technocrat that really appreciated defense analysis, strategic analysis, and was probably one of the most voracious readers of the office's products. Those 3 vignettes sort of show you the office's influence among 3 very different secretaries of defense.
Very interesting. Of course, Donald Rumsfeld then returned to office at a later stage, and that he and Andy Marshall and also Colin Gray were friends. I know that Andy Marshall also commissioned a lot of work. So they were both the products of his office, which was relatively small. He claimed that there'd never been more than 17 people, usually around 15 or something like that. What sort of output did they have? Is some of that declassified now? What does it look like? Is it sort of reports with executive summaries? And then on the other hand, what sort of things did they commission? What sort of funds did they have?
Well, all of those things are really tied together. The Office of Net Assessment throughout its history has, by design, been small. And I think that's both because strategic minds are hard to come by, but also I believe the intent from the beginning was not to fall into the trap of believing that the office could do everything itself. And so the assistants in the office, the military assistants, the civilians, really should be thought of as program managers for a particular area. Their job is to think about a particular area, perhaps write an assessment on a particular area, but not fall into the trap that they can do everything themselves. And so being able to tap into other sources of expertise wherever they are, be that in the US government, be that in academia, be that in the federally funded research and development world, places like RAND and the Institute for Defense Analyses. The study budget became a vehicle for tapping into the best minds and the best approaches. Back to your earlier question about methodology or approaches. If you're a historian, but you think that demography is extremely important, how do you tap into sources of expertise there? And so, on the one hand, yes, the office produced a number of assessments, very highly classified assessments, highly classified because they took into account all the information available, regardless of its source, and meant for the senior leadership, so not meant for public dissemination. So there's a couple of them that have been declassified in one of the recent volumes of Foreign Relations of the United States. You can find kind of bits and pieces, but again, they weren't meant for public consumption. They were meant to inform leaders. But you're also right that the office funded, sponsored a lot of other research. And to include a lot of historical research, frankly, a lot of what we know as the strategic studies canon bears the imprint of the Office of Net Assessment. To take two examples, I don't think the literature on military innovation that we have and take for granted, that literature on military innovation wouldn't exist, and certainly in the form that it exists, without support from the Office of Net Assessment. Similarly, the literature on military effectiveness wouldn't exist if it weren't for sponsorship of the Office of Net Assessment. That wasn't because Andy Marshall was a philanthropist. It was because he realized that a lot of basic research needed to be done in order to inform the net assessment enterprise. He needed frameworks, he needed models, he needed historical case studies to try to inform his work and his office's work in trying to inform and educate senior policymakers.
What efforts did he go to try to ensure that they weren't just going to the usual suspects or people that agreed with them? Because it strikes me what you've been saying is you need a plurality of views, and even history itself isn't neutral. So what was Andy Marshall doing to create this office that would drag in those different perspectives to allow you to get a proper understanding of yourself and your adversaries you described earlier?
Well, a couple things. First, one has to start with his personality. He had a wonderfully curious mind and was always questioning. From the first day I met him to the last time I saw him, which was just a couple weeks before he passed, he was always asking questions, including questions about the past. Did we get it right? Did we really understand this? Was there something that we missed? And over the years, he and I had just wonderful conversations along those lines. And you think about that. Think about somebody at that station, at that time of life. The tendency is to say, oh, yes, look, I got it right. And let's talk about all the ways I got it right. He was always saying, no, maybe we got it wrong. And what might have happened that didn't happen. And so he had that wonderfully open, inquisitive mind throughout his life. So that was one thing. And then second, he invested a lot in new voices, whether accomplished professionals outside of the bubble, outside the usual suspects, but also the next generation. I first came to the office as a graduate student, And he and I stayed in touch throughout the rest of his life. But even in his last years, he just thrived around younger scholars. It goes with that kind of inquisitive, questioning mind. He always wanted to hear different voices and different approaches.
Can I just ask you another line of inquiry? This multiplicity of interests that he had and the way in which he was interested also in strategic culture, in different ways of doing things. There's one comment about how when he was studying the Soviet arsenal, what he came away with was to say how impressed he was about how different it was and how different the Soviet thinking about nuclear weapons was, which other people would then call strategic culture. Are strategic culture and historical trends universally recognized as important for net assessment?
They should be, let's put it that way. Whether it's net assessment or long-term competition, the fact that you have interaction of competitors who are very different, who are marked by their history, by their culture, it really is fundamental. So much international relations theory is premised on states being unitary actors, being like actors, receiving and processing information reliably and just kind of, bouncing off of each other. I think what Marshall saw, and this really does go back to his early days at the Rand Corporation, what he saw when he looked at the Soviet Union, and I think we have to try to recapture what that was like, trying to figure out the Soviet Union at a time when we didn't have satellites, we had very few reconnaissance aircraft. We're trying to figure out what the Soviets were all about. And as he and his colleagues looked at that, they saw patterns of behavior very different from those of the United States. They saw the Soviets investing in air defense on a massive scale in a way that the United States wasn't doing. As the Soviet nuclear arsenal began to take shape, doing things very differently than the United States was doing. And Marshall, as one of a relatively small group of people that had access to some of the most sensitive information available at the time, he was able to take those insights and really run with them, including in this area of organizational culture, strategic culture, just this basic insight that we had a competitor that did things very differently than we did.
You started off talking about the complexity of knowing yourself and knowing your adversary. And I can see how in the context of the United States versus the Soviets, where you've got two primary actors, you might actually be able to get your head around some of that. But one of the great successes, I think, that Andy Marshall has had is that it spawned this desire for offices of net assessment around the world. But I wonder whether either he had a view or you have a view as to how realistic that is. Because if you're not a superpower, you can't act alone. And therefore, it's not only a case of knowing yourself and your adversary, it's knowing yourself and all of the other people that you need to be working with, and your adversary and all of the other people they may be working with. So is it a realistic prospect to try to emulate what Andy Marshall was doing in the US-Soviet era in the more complex global era today in countries that aren't the global hegemon such as the United States?
Well, first off, I'll admit my bias, right? So as somebody who's interested in strategy and interested in strategic studies, I believe that all times, all places, everywhere, it always makes sense to think strategically, and it's always beneficial to some extent. So that's my bias. But beyond my bias, I think it happens to be true. Having the ability to do strategic assessment is valuable whether you are a superpower or a middle power or a smaller power. From the very beginning, the Office of Net Assessment was interested not just in the United States and the Soviet Union, but also looking at, say, the NATO-Warsaw Pact balance, two very different alliances, of course. So it's not just something, for superpowers. I could make the argument that strategy is most in need when one's margin of superiority is waning or is the least. Right. And I think that certainly has been the American experience, which is people get most interested in net assessment and military balances when they're concerned about the military balance. When you think you're way ahead, then, well, why worry about it? You just sort of spend your way out of the problem. For middle powers, for regional powers, doing a good job of assessment is even more important than for a superpower.
Is it a different kind of job, though, to the one that was being done by the United States, or is it fundamentally the same process? And it's just that there are additional, more complex actors?
I think the net assessment approach is transferable. I think regardless of whether you're sitting in Washington or in London or Brussels or Canberra, thinking this way, thinking in terms of complex interaction, thinking in terms of the need to know your enemy and know yourself, I think that can't help but be beneficial. Now, does it look different based on your perspective? Sure. It also looks different based on what particular aspect, what particular military balance you're looking at. Thinking about competition in space looks different than competition in ground forces or something like that. And it takes us back to that multidisciplinary approach to net assessment. It's why one size doesn't fit all. It's why one discipline shouldn't be privileged above all others.
I have two last questions there. And if I may start with one, which is, in commissioning work with these many different disciplines, did it start always with Andy Marshall and his team defining what they were looking for and then asking for bids? Or did they simply encourage people to put forward bids?
A mixture of the two. So in some cases, there were defined things that they knew that they were interested in. Some of that could be very, very mundane. We're looking to develop a long-term data set on X, just because we need that. But in other cases, many other cases, it was being open to interesting ideas, partially formed ideas that others brought to the office. Just to pick up on something you said earlier, you talked about Marshall's modesty. And I think that's true, but I think there's something more to it. I once asked him in retirement, to the extent that you thought you were successful, why were you successful? And he said, because I listened to people. And again, that's so basic, but it is so rare, particularly in the worlds that we inhabit, where everybody wants to tell you what they think. And Marshall was a listener. He was quiet. He was an introvert, but he was a listener, and he saw the value in that. He saw the strategic value in listening to what other people had to say.
And my final question to you then is, are we right to consider Andy Marshall as a strategist?
I really do think so. Again, to borrow from Edward Mead Earle and Peter Perret, he was a maker of modern strategy. During the first part of his career, you could say in a more sort of traditional way, a semi-academic way, as a researcher and a writer. And then in the second part of his career, as a strategist and as a strategic advisor. The man retired after more or less 65 years of public service in two very different, although related capacities. And I just think that's extraordinary.
Dr. Malkin, thank you very much for having made sure that we now all know about this very influential person, Andy Marshall, and we've learned an awful lot in this talk with you. Thank you for having joined us from Washington today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. This has been a RUSI podcast in which once again we have been talking strategy. To find out more about these podcasts and to discover our other episodes, please visit our webpage at rusi.org. Talking Strategy is available to listen to via the RUSI website or on all major streaming platforms. And to be notified about when future episodes are available, you can follow RUSI on social media. Next week, we'll be talking to the United Kingdom Ministry of Defence's own Andrew Marshall, Dr. Rob Johnson, the Director of the Secretary of State's Office of Net Assessment and Challenge, as well as being the Director of the prestigious Changing Character of War programme at the University of Oxford. Our subject next week will be an Oxford graduate, Thomas Edward Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, the colourful insurgent and master of irregular warfare, who played an important part in the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. Someone who was able to balance across cultures and between the technological and human dimensions of warfare, and thus adapt to the circumstances as he found them. Beatrice and I hope that you can join us then. Thank you very much.